Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Christopher Rodello, and welcome to this event. I am an assistant professor of Chicano Latino Studies here at UC Irvine. This is the first of two lectures that are being organized as part of the Queer Latinx Performance and Art series organized by myself to supplement and support two classes I'm teaching this quarter, Chicano Latino Studies 62 and Chicano Latino Studies 125 on Latinx performance. So the goal of this series is to bring to campus leading scholars who are thinking about the connections between Latinx identity formation, queerness and sexuality, and cultural politics, and primarily for undergraduates, but also this event is open to anyone, to the public as a whole. I want to thank the support of UCI Illuminations, the Chancellor's Arts and Culture Initiative, for their funding of this series, and in particular, Debbie Nielsen for her administrative support, and Mia Alvarez for handling promotional materials and creating our really fantastic flyers. I also want to thank Will Alvarez and Natalie Hadlin from UCI Media for helping with technical support for this event. Finally, I want to give a big shout out to Marilu Dom and Debbie Mitchell, our wonderful administrative staff at Chicano Latino Studies, for handling logistics related to our speaker's visit. Before I introduce Dr. Jillian Hernandez, I want to plug the second event in this series, which will be a talk with Dr. Richard Rodriguez from the University of California at Riverside. The title of this talk is The Desirability Conduit, Cinematic Fantasies of Latinx Sexuality and Labor, and it will be held in person on May 23rd at 4 p.m. At UC Irvine in the conference room CD at the Newkirk Alumni Center. And refreshments will be provided. So I really hope, and it's open to everyone. I hope you're able to attend. So I'm now very pleased and honored to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jillian Hernandez. Dr. Jillian Hernandez is a scholar, community arts educator, curator, and creative. Her work is inspired by Black and Latinx life and imagination, and is invested in challenging how working class bodies, sexualities, and cultural practices are policed through gendered tropes of deviancy and respectability. She studies Blackness and Latinidad as relational formations and attends to the political, cultural, and communal dynamics of aesthetic production. Dr. Hernandez received her PhD in Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University and is associate professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Florida. Her book, Aesthetics of Excess, The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment, was published in 2020 by Duke University Press and is one of my favorite things to read right now. And I'm teaching it at my seminar this quarter. I'm very, very excited for my students to engage with it. Her articles have appeared in venues such as Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, Women in Performance, a Journal of Feminist Theory, and the Journal of Popular Musical Studies, among others. She's also the founder of Women on the Rise, an insurgent collective of women of color artists who work with Black and Latina girls in Miami, Florida. Over the course of a decade, Women on the Rise Collective engaged thousands of girls in art making and critical dialogues about gender and society through feminist art. Her practice as a curator has centered on the work of emerging women artists working in performance, photography, and new media. Exhibitions she has curated and co-curated have been on view at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, Boss Fisher Invitational, Maryland Art Place, Space Mountain Miami, the Welch Gardens at Georgia State University, and other venues. In 2015, Dr. Hernandez also co-founded the Rebel Quinceañera Collective with Jessica Garcia Hernandez and Hilda Gracie Uriarte in San Diego, California. RQC utilized creative expression and informal conversations with high school students to challenge the policing of Latina girls' bodies. She also engaged youth in community arts through her work as a teaching artist with artists mentoring against racism, drugs, and violence and the Puerto Rican Action Board in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So Dr. Hernandez will be speaking on the topic Nameplates and Perreo, the queerness of Chongas. After her event, we'll move into a Q&A. So I encourage you to please save your questions for that portion of the event and put them in the Q&A box below. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hernandez. Thank you for joining us virtually at UC Irvine, and I look forward to learning and engaging with your work.
Thank you, Christopher. This is such an exciting invitation. I'm really happy to connect with you through this talk and with your students primarily. And I I've really organized this as more of a chat, a sort of thinking through. I want to start by just expressing my solidarity with all the students who are organizing for an end to Palestinian oppression right now. It's been very difficult to focus on organizing this talk with everything that is going on. Like, it's just been such a difficult time overall. And particularly so over the last few months. So definitely thinking about students organizing, thinking about Palestine, and thinking about like what the university, what scholars, what we do, what this kind of space opens up and makes possible and is sort of responsible for or should be responsible for. So you know, that's all in my head right now too. So happy to make whatever connections we can make between what I'm going to share with you today and like what is happening out in the world, the extreme violence and repression that we're seeing, but also the extreme love and sacrifice and solidarity that we're seeing, and just sort of holding all of that together. I am chatting with you all from Gainesville, Florida, which is the ancestral lands of the Patano and Timucua peoples. And you know, where Ron DeSantis is running shit. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now, but I'm very excited to share with you all some meditations on the queerness of Chongas. And I want to name that a lot of this work really stemmed from conversations that I've had with my students in Latinx sexualities class, and you know, the sort of pedagogical space, and being in Florida and working with students from Florida who live sort of Chonga culture has been so rich for me as a teacher, as a thinker. And so I will be bringing them in and calling upon them in different ways as I share with you today. So what I'm sharing with you today are some archives of Chonga queerness that I've been collecting over the last few years, and I'll be sharing a little bit from a article, a book chapter that actually came out in an anthology called Critical Diálogos en Latinx Studies, that was co-edited by Merida Rua and Ana Ramos Zayas. And I don't know if many people know about my essay in there called Chongivity Activity. You can find it on my website, but I'll be sharing a little bit from there because that is a piece where I'm really getting into thinking around the politics of Chonga identity. So I'm going to share some images throughout. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those up. So I'm thinking about nameplates and Perreo. I'm not going to get too much into nameplates, but I do have an essay in this fantastic book that recently came out called The Nameplate Jewelry Culture and Identity, where I talk about how my father actually worked at a jewelry exchange in New York City in the 80s, and how I would go along with him to work in the summers, and how that sort of, I have a picture of him in the book. This is him holding like a really wild custom nameplate piece and watch that he worked on. And in the piece, I talk about like this history that I have with like the material culture of jewelry, but also with the fact that when I'm thinking about the nameplates, I'm thinking about them as an expression of love and also how they emerged. My nameplate has I don't have it anymore because my family had to pawn all our jewelry at a very difficult financial moment, which I talk about in Aesthetics of Excess. But Um, my name was misspelled in my birth certificate. And so in the essay that I have here called Nameplate Love Alchemy, I talk about how my mom was really young when she had me. She was like 18 years old. And I feel like they misspelled my name in this sort of act of like not really taking seriously my mother as like a young, pregnant Puerto Rican woman. And what does it mean to think about the history of misnaming of colonized people, right? And what archives and the historical record sort of like erases when it comes to our names. But also in thinking about Chonga politics, the nameplate being sort of like a primary signifier of the sort of deviant femininity that the Chonga identity is like supposed to be signifying, right? And I've been thinking a lot about Perreo. Also over the last several years, chongas are definitely part of Perreo culture, but also thinking about the Verano Intenso in Puerto Rico of 2019 and the ways in which this particular kind of racialized, erotic, working class dance was very much put on, was made visible as a kind of political language, even though like it had always been that. So I'm thinking of all these things together. So some folks might be familiar with my earlier work on Chongas and the Chonga girls and the 2007 Chongalicious video that I've written a lot about. But here I'm both thinking back to the Chongalicious video, but very much sort of looking forward. And considering more recent archives that really get us to think about the queer potential and the queerness that's inherent. I might argue, I and some of my interlocutors might argue in Chonga culture. So this talk came just in time with the news that just emerged that the Chonga girls, the originators of the 2007 YouTube video, are working with CBS and developing a comedy series. And this to me is really interesting because the question that I'm sitting with is like, what in this social and political moment would such a show have to offer? If some of you aren't familiar with the Chongalicious video that I'm referencing, it was a video made by these two performers, Mimi Davila and Laura Di Lorenzo, who at the time didn't identify as Chongas, but who made like a really funny video when they were teenagers that was sort of like making fun of Chonga style. So they would do their lip liner with Sharpie. They would glue their hair down with like stick glue, wearing hoop earrings, jewelry, acrylic nails, as a kind of parody of the sort of hyper feminine, very working class, loud um, construct of the Chonga. And in my work, I really unpack sort of the politics of how this video and how this representation of Chongas became a moment where Latina girls were hyper visible and where a particular kind of working class Latina was hyper visible culturally, but she was visible as a kind of joke. She was visible in a way that contained the potential disruptive difference to norms of like white femininity, of class comportment, and of race and racial difference that I think Chongas have the potential to embody. But the video and the way it was received was very much, I think, like a sort of containment of the potential difference and the potential agitation that a figure like the Chonga might represent. And so I feel very ambivalent about the Chonga Licious video as a cultural text. These two performers, after my book came out, have since shared their displeasure with my critical reading of their video, which we can talk about more in the Q&A. Um, but to me it's like I totally get how the YouTube video at one point was a kind of affirming representation, particularly for Miami youth who were already familiar with Chonga culture, which is distinct from related forms of Latinx hyperfemininity, let's say like Chola culture. um it was affirming, but it also was safe. And so we can talk a little bit more about that. So for me, getting this news, this is 2024. This is almost 20 years after they initially made the YouTube video that since went viral. I'm just really wondering what the narrative is going to be. I believe that the story is that they are the Chonga girls like go to LA to try to become like famous actresses, which is real to their story as actresses, and that they just end up like working at a makeup counter somewhere near like the Hollywood Walk of Fame or something, and that's the story. So anyway, I will hold any thoughts until I actually see what they come up with. But I think the question for me is like what continues to be the enduring interest in Chonga Girls, but particularly embodied by these two performers who admitted that they themselves don't identify as Chongas. And so that's a whole other question we can have around appropriation, because I think when we think about cultural appropriation, we're often thinking about it through this like majoritarian, minoritarian sort of idea of a sort of dominant white culture that then takes from racialized communities. But like, I really encourage in my work that we think about like the intra-cultural dynamics of this, where folks who have access to particular kinds of racial privilege, class privilege, um, also can appropriate within their own community spaces, right? So, this sort of CBS co-signing of Chongas so recently is sort of right on time for the conversation that we're going to have. And so also I think um thinking a lot about Jose Esteban Munoz and disidentifications in this moment too. And like what are the ways in which queer Latinx of color um continue to have to perform, right, disidentification with these various sort of cultural forms. And I'm thinking a lot about Jose, just as Joshua Chambers Letson does in After the Party, in the wake of all of the social and political upheaval that we've been living through over the last several years, particularly since 2016. I mean, since colonization, but if we want to talk more recently, but thinking a lot about Jose and how he would be sort of theorizing what the figures of Chongas might have to offer us now. And I think that's sort of where I'm at, and I don't have a resolved thought, but like what does the queerness of Chonga culture have to offer us in this particular moment? So I hope that's more of a conversation. So some folks that I am thinking about, as I am thinking about the queerness of Chonga culture, are folks who are inviting us to consider Chonga culture beyond its association with Cuban American culture. And Cuban, like dominant narratives of Cuban American culture constructed as a sort of performance of Latinidad that is very much sort of politically conservative, white identifying, right? Particularly if we're thinking about this through like histories of Miami and the ways in which the assimilation of Cuban Americans in Miami really came about through an avowedly anti-Black narrative, an avowedly like anti-Marielito refugee narrative, right? So very much sort of like Cuban American positioning of power, and I'm part Cuban American, so I'm implicated in this too. Has very much sort of operated through a sort of particular class politic and a particular kind of like anti-Black politic that was also anti-Central American, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Haitian. And so in recent years, I've been excited to see the work of folks who are from Miami, who are from places like Hialeah, which is first of all the place where Jose Esteban Munoz grew up, and also is a place that is laden with a lot of like racialized and gendered signifiers, right? So there's like a big sort of if you're from Miami, you might have heard Hialeah, agua, fango y factoria, which basically means like Hialeah is just a place that's like flooded and like full of like dirty factories. And so Hialeah carries a lot of significations of a kind of racialized, labor working class. And that imaginary has also been one that has been framed very much through a kind of like Cuban American imaginary as a Cuban American space, even though Hialeah means prairie in Seminole language, indigenous language. Um, but I'm looking to folks like Joel Gaítan, a Nicaraguan self-taught Miami artist who is from Hialeah and who creates artwork that references long-standing indigenous traditions of ceramics in Central America, and who sort of infuses these traditional ceramics with Chonga aesthetics. So I'm in really like super early stages of researching Joel's work. Joel is hard to get a hold of, so I'm still like, just bombarding the inbox, they're booked and busy. But I'm really just excited to learn more about their practice because it is a kind of aesthetic that I feel, particularly if we think about like racial dynamics in Miami, where Central American folks, indigenous folks are very much discriminated against and like positioned as less than in the sort of hierarchy of racial, Latinidad race in Miami. So I just really am so pulled by the nameplates on these very traditional sculptures. They're also like very queer and sexual. They have like nipple rings. They hold cute little Telfar bags. They have gold teeth, and I think, are very much in a kind of Miami aesthetic that not only sort of references a kind of like queer Latinidad, but also is very clear about the references to African American and Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Latinx style practices that create Chonga culture as well. So for me, these sculptures read to me as little chongies. And when you see the figure that has the Hialeah nameplate with the bamboo earrings, I mean, it's an unmistakable Chonga reference. And what I find to be so beautiful, I'll show a few more images. What I find to be so beautiful about them is that they're also infused with spirituality, which is also something that I've been thinking with my interlocutors about, is like how Chonga culture also and practices of this bodily adornment also can enact forms of spirituality and spell making. And so when I see Joel's work and in interviews, he does talk about how he grew up Pentecostal and how a lot of that sort of like devotional spiritual practice is still there in like how he creates these objects. And so he describes them as genderqueer. He doesn't ascribe them gender. And I don't know if I ended up being able to include this other image, but sometimes, no, I didn't. Sometimes they're very like, they're engaging in queer sex, and there's like a long history of indigenous ceramics, with all kinds of like sexually explicit and queer sex happening. So I'm just excited to see a kind of cultural production emerge that is queer that is Chonga and that is Central American, because that is not a narrative that we necessarily have seen. So hopefully more on that in future work. And then also when I think about the queerness of Chongas, I think about the work of Juliesy and Karla. They no longer work together or perform in Miami. I mean, Karla does. Karla Croqueta, her drag name, does still perform in Miami, but Juliesy and Bed does not. I think they moved to Texas, but they spent a few years, I would say from like 2015-ish to 2018, performing together in Chonga drag. And so I'm gonna share a little bit of writing that I've done about them. And then I'm going to play a video where you can see them perform in person. So loud, assertive, and stylistically spectacular, the working class figure of the Chonga, embodied by young Latina women in Miami, inspires both admiration and denigration among her fellow residents. Her no-nonsense attitude commands respect, but her fashion sense, marked by large gold hoop earrings, tight spandex outfits, and dramatic makeup, is often mocked as excessive. The Chonga's comportment and sexual body presentation are read as gender nonconforming, and her performances of ethnicity, heavily accented Spanglish, stylistic citations of Blackness, indifference to assimilating into whiteness, as aberrant. Above all other characterizations, the Chonga is defined by her hyper-femme aesthetics, as famously depicted by the Latina creators of the viral Chongalicious YouTube video of 2007. Mimi Davila and Laura Di Lorenzo, who at the time were theater students in an arts magnet school in Miami, parody the Chonga style by using stick glue for hair gel and Sharpie pens for lip liner. Despite the numerous ways that Chongas are policed for their transgressions of gender, ethnic performance, and fashion, their bodies nevertheless signal ethnic belonging and are sometimes celebrated among residents for how they mark Miami as a site of undisciplined performances of Latinidad. The city, like Chongas, is also perceived in the wider US imaginary as aesthetically, ethnically, and sexually over the top. The forms of relation I center on today would be called Chongivity activity by Latinx in Miami, who use the term when observing the collaborative troublemaking behaviors of Chongas. Chongivity activity describes the shameless and often gender nonconforming actions that Chongas and other rebel Latinx engage in together. These activities can range from public disturbances, such as tagging a public wall or dancing on a pool table at a bar, to creating cultural work such as art and YouTube videos. It often entails practices of makeup and dress undertaken with the help of one's homegirls, and it is this aspect that my commentary will center on. I use Chongivity activity as a framework for analyzing how a range of women and queer Latinx cultural producers use makeup and other forms of working class, feminized, and criminalized forms of aesthetic labor to sustain relations with each other. Consideration of these practices provides a critical understanding of how women and queer Latinx exchange through hyperfemininity to collaboratively execute projects that push back against gendered and racialized sociocultural exclusions and create alternative spaces and representations. These activities tend to agitate norms of racialized gender within and outside of Latinx communities. Additionally, Chongivity activity performs an organic archiving of feminized cultural practices that would otherwise face erasure, as they are not perceived as meriting historical value by dominant US nationalist narratives and masculinized tropes of Latino resistance, as femme aesthetic body practices and masculinized tropes of Latinx resistance, as femme aesthetic body practices are often viewed as apolitical and unproductive waste of time and money. So I'm really thinking with Juliesy and Karla about the ways in which their work is a form of placemaking and sort of fomented queer Latinx placemaking. So I'm going to just give a little bit of background on them, and then I'm going to share a video. Drag performers Juliesy in Bed and Karla Croqueta have an established following in Miami. Their signature aesthetic of tight spandex clothing and garish makeup, coupled with gaudy jewelry and their thick, dark beards, have made them the unlikely darlings of the Miami nightlife scene. So when I wrote this, they were still performing. They are often booked to host various parties in the city in both queer and straight venues, to which they bring their raucous, chongalicious sense of humor and engaging participants. The way Giovanni Profera in the white outfit, Juliesy, and Josue Garcia, Karla, come together to become Juliesy and Karla, and the effects it has had on Miami's queer social landscape embody the connective and place-making potential of Chongivity activity. Profeta and Garcia are two queer men who were longtime neighborhood friends. They grew up together in the working-class Cuban-American enclave of Hialeah in Miami. In my individual interviews with the performers, they described how they came about their Chongivity activity, as many Chongas do, in response to being broke. One night, they wanted to go out partying, but did not have money to buy drinks, so they decided to crash a lesbian ladies' night by donning drag. Gathering their outfits on the fly, Garcia wore a rain poncho with a sequin tube top worn as a crop top, paired with what he describes as a, quote, Tina Turner wig. Profeta wore a tube top paired with his underwear, adding, quote, it took 3 hours to put on our makeup. We looked horrible. It was so bad. The precision wasn't right. We didn't know what the fuck we were doing, end quote. Despite being kicked out of the bar for dancing on the pool table, Garcia giddily recalls that Profeta looked at him and said, quote, I look like such a chonga. I feel like a chonga. Did you feel that? That was amazing, end quote. The lingering high of their Chongivity activity led them to repeat their performance of Juliesy and Karla that same week at the gay Latinx club Azúcar in Miami, where they performed a rendition of Destiny Child's song Say My Name during Drag Wars night. They recount that no one clapped, and they were ridiculed for what was perceived as a failed drag performance. Juliesy and Karla's bearded chonga drag aesthetic dramatically departs from the more conventional modes of drag popular in the Miami nightlife scene, which aim for glamour, feminine realness, and celebrity impersonation. This is an aesthetic that Juliesy and Karla's working class and ethnic penchant for discount fashion store spandex getups and chonga makeup markedly departs from. Though they felt discouraged by this initial rejection in the gay nightclub scene, they nevertheless decided to take their chonga performance to the streets when prompted by mutual friend Will Gonzalez, an amateur filmmaker who wanted to feature them in a series of videos. The resulting YouTube videos, titled Hialeah's Finest, feature Juliesy and Karla engaging in various forms of chongivity activity. In episode 1, they cause a commotion by getting into a mock argument with each other on a bus stop in Hialeah during rush hour traffic. Profeta recalls, quote, people honked, perra, sucia. The best one was traga leche, which I won't, if you don't know what that means, I'm just going to keep it moving. While some passersby joked along with them in good humor, these loaded sexist and homophobic epithets revealed how their performance also agitated respectable conventions of Latinx gender and sexuality through their queerly hyperfeminine suciedad. Latinx cultural studies scholar Deborah Vargas describes suciedad as, quote, a trope for feminine gendered subjectivities associated with seedy working class Latino spaces, including queer femmes, non-normative working and underclass women of color, and travesti and transgender Latinas, end quote. The sucia's gender nonconformity is read through tropes of contamination. They are subjects to be sanitized and or expelled from the social. The Hialeah's Finest Episode 1 video was shot in close proximity to Profeta and Garcia's neighborhood, which made them vulnerable to being seen by family members. The video captures Profeta receiving an angry phone call from his mother while he and Garcia flirt with men in the Westland Mall parking lot as Juliesy and Karla. Garcia shared, quote, Gio gets a call from his mom. Your son is on 49th Street dressed like a hooker, and he's with a fat hooker, end quote. Minutes later, Profeta's mother appears in the parking lot shouting at the performers from her red Jeep, yelling, quote, Ustedes son machos, you are men. This unscripted scene reveals the multi-layered forms that the policing of suciedad takes, from street harassment to family disapproval, all of which Profeta and Garcia appear to take in stride. In fact, they drew energy from what Jessica Garcia Hernandez would call these agitated responses and used them to extend their comedic performances further. Juliesy and Karla's improvised enactments and guerrilla documentations of Chonga identity inspire both laughter and disgust. Though they take up the oppositional practice of Chonga femininity, their practice is not invested in presenting a restorative representation. Like the viral cholafied.com Tumblr page that features celebrity faces like Jay-Z transformed into cholas through digital makeovers, Juliesy and Karla's drag performances signal what Monica Huerta would describe as, quote, a barbed affection for chongas that, quote, seeks an aesthetic posture besides denigration without the explicit hopes of reconstitution or humanizing. There's no innocence in these made-up images. That's why there could be laughter. So before I continue with the analysis, let's watch episode 2 of Hialeah's Finest.
Hialeah! Hialeah in the place!
Obalaka! Hialeah! Obalaka! Hialeah!
Obalaka Hialeah is the place to be. It is my world. I can fix my hair and nails even though I'm an ugly girl. Look, chica, you gotta check it out. We'll eat some churros, we'll scream and shout. Hialeah!
¡Ay, Carla! ¡Carla!
¡Ay, pinga!
¡Fría!
Mi primo, tú estás tirado
Ay,
hoy.
yo sé, vamos,
Ay,
vamos.
pero-
Oh, ¿tú sabes por qué? Porque vi una cosa en el Facebook.
Ay, tú siempre con
No,
el
no, pero
Facebook.
oye,
Siempre.
planking, you have to plank.
¿Qué es eso?
Oye,
¿Una planca?
una planca. Ya.
Pero eso no es de hacer
No,
ejercicio.
pero tú-
Oye, I'm not gonna do no exercise, no plancha.
Ay, no
No.
tienes que planchar, mi hermana. It's called planking.
¿Qué es eso?
Planking is when you lay down
Ajá.
and you just lay down. But you lay down
Oh, it's
like,
kinda like
on
sex,
a
right?
sign, a little bit, but you lay down like on a sign.
had sex on a sign.
You lay down on a what do you call? Like you lay down. Wait.
Like
you,
on a bed.
Wait. You lay down.
Like this?
No, on your stomach.
Oh,
En la barriga.
I'm pregnant, girl.
No,
I can
you're
do
not
that.
pregnant.
I think so.
So you
You
lay
know-
down. You lay down on your
No,
stomach,
listen.
flat on like a McDonald's sign, on the expressway, on Westfield Mall, on that Hialeah.
I had sex in Westfield Mall.
For real?
Yeah,
Let's
right.
go planking.
Ay.
Ven.
I'm not gonna do
Oye,
that.
dale.
That's not nice, girl.
Carla, dale.
But why?
Obalaka Hialeah is the place to be. It is my world. I can fix my hair and nails even though I'm an ugly girl. Look, chica, you gotta check it out. We'll eat some churros, we'll scream and shout. Hialeah! Hialeah! We'll buy some platanitos. They got Haitian food too. My boyfriend Orly told me that he wants to fuck you.
Hola.
You should plank. Come on.
I already told you I'm not gonna play. You didn't hear what Manolito, my neighbor, said?
What did he say?
That's the slave stuff. So I'm not gonna do that stuff.
He did
It's
not
not
say
nice.
it was slave stuff. I want to plank.
No, bro. I said
Well, then
no.
you give me a boost. Give me a boost. Give me a boost.
I can't.
Give me a
I'm
boost.
hungry.
Give me a boost. But just give me a boost and I'll pick
No.
up too.
And where are you gonna play? What do you think? Is
Right
it anywhere?
here. That's a perfect spot.
Whatever. It says Hialeah.
I know.
Whatever.
Hialeah's fine.
Obalaka! Hialeah!
Obalaka Hialeah is the place to be. It is my world. I can fix my hair and nails even though I'm an ugly girl. Look, chica, you gotta check it out. We'll eat some churros, we'll scream and shout. Hialeah! Hialeah! We'll buy some platanitos. They got Haitian food too. My boyfriend Orly told me that he wants to fuck you.
Obalaka! Hialeah! Obalaka! Hialeah!
Obalaka Hialeah, I'm getting too. Obalaka Hialeah, welcome you. Welcome you. Welcome you.
Obalaka! Hialeah! Obalaka! Hialeah!
I need to find out who wrote that song, and I actually never asked them, but I really do need to find that out because it's amazing. The laughter induced by performances such as the queer spatial appropriation enacted by Juliesy in episode 2, as she scales and planks a public city sign that reads Hialeah, City of Progress, fomented a local audience for their Chonga drag through the circulation of the Hialeah's Finest series on YouTube. As Profeta elaborates, quote, alongside and through the videos, everyone learned how to accept us, so we got more acceptance in the nightlife scene. I'm starting to get higher clientele, the ones that want to have a good time, a different vibe, end quote. The eager consumption of the Juliesy and Karla personas parallels the commodification of Chonga embodiment that occurred in the wake of the viral Chongalicious video of 2007, which branded the young performers as upcoming Latina starlets with crossover potential. Like the Chongalicious creators, Davila and Di Lorenzo, Profeta and Garcia created these performances in the context of their leisure time together as friends and did not set out to create a product. Yet the spectacular embodiments and performances of Chonga identity they authored have nevertheless been received as such, prompting these performers to draw what cultural and material capital could accrue from an identity that in vernacular context often constitutes a liability to social, educational, and economic success in a neoliberal context. Spurred by the local coverage they received following the posting of the Hialeah's Finest videos by publications such as the Miami New Times, Juliesy and Karla started booking steady gigs at straight clubs where, rather than a social atmosphere, their performances were received more like, quote, a circus act, according to Garcia, who quickly added, it pays the bills, I ain't complaining, end quote. Performing in gay venues was not a vastly different experience, as their performances were often mocked. As Profeta explains, quote, we had to move away from Miami Beach to get the opportunity. When we moved out of the beach, we went to Wynwood. Now we're with all these artists, end quote. Leaving the homonormative club scene in Miami Beach led the performers to the Wynwood Arts District and to collaborations with local queer artists like Sleeper, who suggested that they collaborate on organizing their own queer night at the Corner Bar, a straight venue. They established Counter Corner, a queer party night in 2014, and it continued to feature emerging drag talent on the third Sunday of every month. The parties have become so popular that the venue can hardly hold attendees. The space has also fomented a decidedly genderqueer and tropicalized Miami-specific mode of drag aesthetic, innovated by performers such as Queef Latina, Miss Dodo, and Jupiter Velvet. As Profeta explains, quote, Counter Corner is a strictly party, and I do that for the community because I love that scene. It's young artists that just need self-expression they are not getting in their day-to-day lives, so they dress up, end quote. And reflecting on the unprecedented growth of Counter Corner, Garcia reflects, quote, the first time we hosted, there were very few people. Now you get there and you can't even move. I cry almost every single Counter Corner. People say, thank you for creating this judgment-free space. I don't feel like I'm going to be harassed. Trans, straight, queer, I've gotten to know people on a personal level. Everyone there is woke as fuck. It's become a safe space, end quote. Garcia and Profeta juxtapose Counter Corner to the more mainstream gay venues in the city that operate on a homonormative framework that's exclusionary to femme, larger-bodied, and trans queers. Their co-creation of this space amid the rapid gentrification of downtown Miami, of Wynwood, and of Hialeah mirrors the queer spatial appropriation they performed when planking the Hialeah City of Progress sign. Counter Corner signifies an alternative urban narrative of progress that thrives on suciedad. So that is part of the queer Chonga archive that I'm building. And I'm just going to share a few more musings on queer Chonganess, and then I hope to get into some dialogue with folks. So a major icon of queer Chonga culture is LaGoony Chonga. She is a reggaetonera, trap reggaetonera from Miami. She started her performance career as a sex worker. She was a stripper for a long time, and she was concurrently rapping. And at a recent concert that I attended with my student Ceci Luna, who gave me permission to share this image of LaGoony signing their chest, I was really taken by the visuals that LaGoony had in her performance. I felt like as we were watching, like she was performing, and it was this augmentation of her Chonga aesthetic on the screen, where the screen would have like close-ups of her gold teeth, it would have close-ups of her nails, close-ups of her makeup, and at certain points it almost felt like you were being sort of hypnotized by by her Chonga aesthetic, or like a spell was sort of happening through the aesthetic. So I'm thinking about like the Chonga as an hechicera, the Chonga as an agent of sort of like magic making through the aesthetic. So I have a little bit of video of that projection that she had at this December 2023 concert that I attended. There is a way in which I think that kind of the visuals, the soft fading in, the soft fading out, I think get to what I hope in future writing to get to around the sort of like spiritual dimensions of the Chonga aesthetic, right? Like what are the ways in which spiritual practices, kind of like what Joel Gaítan is sort of like hinting at in their work too, what is the sort of way in which feminine body practice is also like ritual, and also enacts like a kind of spell making through femininity. And there's many people that have thought about femininity as a sort of form of magic, or like spell making in captivating folks, right, and getting attention and getting things that you want, right? Also as a femme, like that's also a really important aspect of this. So I hope to do sort of more careful readings of LaGoony Chonga's aesthetics, because I do think that she's sort of like touching on that aspect of Chonga embodiment too. Then I must talk about Maria Saldana, who is Indigenous Charapa bisexual femme, healer, and organizer, who has been doing a lot of important sort of organizing work around queer Latina femmes. And so I place her in the queer Chonga universe for the work that she does. She has an advice column for them, the queer publication Them, called Maria Pero No Santa, where she offers advice to folks. So you can send her any questions you might have. But what I love so much about Maria is the way in which, just like with Joel Gaítan, as a Peruvian indigenous femme from Miami, is sort of complicating the narrative around Chongas, and avowedly talking about like bisexuality and naming that and naming indigeneity, where that's sort of where my sort of juxtaposition with this idea of like a CBS show on Chongas, like I would be surprised if queerness was a part of like what that TV show will eventually entail. Who knows? But I'm finding that like through this network of Chongis in Miami, who are not only sort of like building community, but creating their own sets of archives outside of the academy that that sort of collect information around the culture that they're creating. So Maria, I'm going to go back to that in a second, but Maria recently published, last summer published an article on queerness, the queerness of Chongas, right? Chongis, called Chongis Have Always Been Queer, 6 Miamians on what the South Florida subculture means to them, which also features other folks in our community. So some of these folks are students of mine or artists that I know, like Jess Troches, like Art Chonga, Yanesi. So, she included me in the article. So there's this way in which I think we're in a moment that is sort of taking the narrative around Chongas into our own hands, because I think a lot of the recent conversations around like appropriation of Latina self-fashioning have really sparked, I think, more of an impetus around this. So like with Hailey Bieber, you know, last fall, and like the brownie glazed lip phenomenon, where people were acting like if Hailey Bieber invented like brown lip liner. Or if we think about the clean girl aesthetic that became really popular, there's this way in which we continue to see how these like queer chongi aesthetics continue to produce value and frame folks as cultural innovators while completely ignoring the ways in which queer Latinx feminine people have like been at the forefront of these practices. So part of my project also has been sort of more like public facing work around femininity and racialized femininity. So I did start a YouTube podcast that's been on hiatus for a little bit, but I'll be releasing more. I have like several episodes in my computer that need to be edited. But over the summer, I'll be releasing more regularly my podcast called Femme Study, where I really celebrate femme culture, scholarship, and organizing. So I have an episode with Maria where we actually talk about the queerness of Chonga culture. So you're welcome to check that out and hear a little bit more of our conversation. But I do want to play a little portion where Maria talks about that relationship of Chonga identity with queerness. So I will cue that up.
I mean, I remember also in my chonginess queerness was always there. I think particularly in the ways that I would like romanticize and like always crush on chongis in particular. So me, they always, right, their lips, I like what attracted to their lips. Their lip gloss was popping always. They always smelled like violetas or herbal essence, right? The leaving, like,
oh my god, like, herbal essence, you like just took in it there. That's class, 100.
Like in math class, there was always the chongis in my class, and they just smelled amazing. And so of course there was a natural like attraction to me. My queerness was always known, but I'm really curious how you see, or if you see, a relationship.
Yeah, so Maria's comments really, I think, get a little bit to also, I think, the that multi-sensory and aesthetic aspect, right, of the erotics also of Chonganess, and the queer erotics of Chonganess also, right? Like the politics of that, like Chonga attraction through smell, through the visual that LaGoony Chonga was also evoking in her performance as well. And Perreo, I haven't talked about yet, but one thing that has also emerged in Miami is a party, and now it's grown into like various different ones. It was Out of Service, El Perreo, now there's like Witches of Miami and all these other parties, but there's been a growing scene along with the more trans inclusive and femme inclusive scene that I talked about earlier with Juliesy and Carla and counterculture. There's also been a sort of movement in Miami of like femme-centered perreo spaces, like femme and queer-centered. And so when Maria was a student in my 2019 fall Latinx sexualities class, she created a little film that documents Out of Service and talks a little bit about some of these issues. So I would love to share that with you. And then I believe that might be where I close. We'll see.
My name is Lucia. Why do you like going to Perreo?
One, it's fun. I really didn't think that the me of like years ago did not even like this music, or like I didn't think that I would like this music. fact that it's fun and I like dancing, and there's a certain freedom in dancing music in Spanish.
El reggaetón la pone tricky, se pega como Kiki, como ella tiene Ricky Ricky. La vida nunca tuvo Ricky, la vida.
If you sign something, it'll be sure. Señoras y señores, latinos del mundo.
Okay, well, y'all know who I am. Maria, she, hers. Identify indigenous, Peruana, white, person. I identify as a bisexual cisgender woman. We're here at Perreo. I'm just really excited.
reggaetón, dale sincero. Por eso friki, 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 frikitona, dale frikitona. Por eso friki, 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 frikitona, dale frikitona. Por eso friki, 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 frikitona, dale frikitona. Por eso friki, 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 frikitona.
I can't think of a better way to top that, so I will end there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez. That was such like a fabulous talk, and I'm still thinking and processing all the different things you're talking about. I'm sure all of us are very much grateful for your presentation. So I'll let folks kind of put in questions in the Q&A, but I'll start off with the question. I guess I was really curious to hear more about how you're thinking about friendship in your project. Like
Yeah.
how, friendship, both, I think of like the duo performers we have, And also your own relationship, your own relationship with the performers and the artists that you're kind of engaging with, and as you're creating this queer Chonga archive, like I'm just really curious how friendship works and how you think through that as a form
Yeah.
of relationality.
Thank you so much. You know, I haven't thematized that as much as I should. And I think friendship, I think like mutual aid, like even in watching this footage that Maria documented from 2019 and like seeing Planned Parenthood at the Perreo and all the ways in which like these chongis already anticipated like the dystopia of like DeSantian politics or whatever here in Florida in particular, right? And so like the ways in which like this was already sort of happening and happening through this space that I think like many folks might assume is like apolitical, misogynistic, all of these other things, right? But that's definitely something I want to thematize. And I think friendship between and among my students. And I think like also another aspect and kind of like a messier and trickier and riskier aspect of this work for me is like friendships and relationships that I start to foment with my students when we teach about this material. Like it's so difficult to pretend that like we're not building relationships as we like sit in these classrooms and like talk about a lot of this. So there's definitely like multiple layers of that. So I really appreciate you naming that. And it's so true. Like you have the duos or the trios and all of these things. And also I think with both Juliesy and Carla, and also with Maria's example, you know, Maria's talking about like meeting folks that she since has collaborated on. You know, they have the Pumas collective that was responding to protect like queer folks in Peru during like recent moments of political unrest. So again, like these relationships happened and were fomented in these like chongi spaces and these performative chongi spaces. So I even forgot in playing the video that LaGoony Chonga was like at that Perreo, right? So like all of these things are very much sort of part of this like chongi stew that really holds, I think, a lot of potential.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so folks, feel free to add any questions you have to the Q&A. I guess while we're waiting for folks, I guess another question I had was you kind of talked a little bit about the Chongalicious, like the creators' like response to your writing about them. So I'm curious, like I guess both that, but also how you think about engage with people like contemporary artists and creators, right? And how you sort of establish those relationships, especially with people that, you know, maybe you don't always agree with what they're doing, or you're sort of thinking through those like kind of thorny kind of representational politics and just, yeah, just like all those kinds of things. I talk about it a lot with my students and we're thinking about Latinx cultural production, like how do we engage with creators and artists like ethically, but also, you know, with the critique that, you know, it leads towards like the vision of like Latinx cultural politics we want that is more inclusive and more relational. So I'm curious how you
Yeah.
think about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I typically reach out to folks for interviews with Chongalicious. It was such a big cultural text that I was more interested in that work, not so much in talking to them and not like in a bad way, but it was already such a huge like cultural text in that moment that I felt like I really just wanted to stay at the like cultural level of analysis. And so I never reached out to them to interview them, but after the book came out, and it's so funny how the Miami New Times is such a part of how all of this goes down. When my book came out, there was an article about it in the Miami New Times. And so that's how they found out about it. And so I get this like random email from them one day after my book is out, basically saying that they want to talk to me. But it was like a very hostile email. It was very much pretty much saying like that I didn't, because one thing I don't talk about in my work on Chongas is like they did this other series called the Chonga Diaries, which I never got to. Like my whole book is not about Chongas or Chongalicious, which I think got lost in their response to me. But to make a long story short, basically they felt that that my critique of their cultural text was unfair. And that in the Chonga Diaries, they do enact a more nuanced representation. And so I said, I'm so sorry, I never looked at that. I already had to cut down a lot of what was happening in the chapter because for folks familiar with the book, like, I'm talking about different contemporary artists. I'm talking to young girls in Miami, like it's not about them. And I think they just didn't get that. And they also were like, and also that video, like your book came out so much longer than when our video came out, and we've done so much more. And then I just had to be like, academia's whack. So this is why like my book is coming out like 13 years later, right? Like that's also just academia. So not in a condescending way, but also like we need to bridge. Like it's different for me if I was a journalist to write about what you're doing now, but when I'm an academic, like I might write something and not see it out in print for like so many years, right? So it was just a lot, but they almost wanted like an apology from me for my critiques of it, and that was definitely an impasse. And when someone had reached out to me, so we had this really uncomfortable Zoom meeting. And then someone had reached out to me who's familiar with the Miami scene to do a podcast. And I was like, oh, what might be cool is if like they joined the podcast and like we could have this kind of mediated conversation around it. So I did offer that and they declined. So yeah, that's the only instance, to be honest. Usually I have really good relationships with the cultural producers that I write about. But in this instance, like I did launch critique, but it's not fully a critique. I think talk about the ways in which, as they did try to become more mainstream actresses, the Hollywood system made it hard for them to have more nuanced roles, which is why I think they're still doing Chonga Girls and not doing something else. I don't know if that's really what they want to be doing, to be honest. So yeah, it was very difficult. It was a very uncomfortable and not fun conversation.
All right. So we have a couple questions, excuse me, in the Q&A. The first one, how can we use and create these aesthetics as mediums in our own lives?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in my next book. So I'm so glad you mentioned that. My next project is really thinking about femininity, and I'm thinking about how femmes of color, particularly post 2016, have mobilized feminine aesthetics to make demands for care and for resources. So I'm looking at artists who are engaging politics, like Yvette Mayorga, Chicana visual artist who uses very feminine aesthetics to talk about like US-Mexico border politics. I'm also looking at Shira Seven, the gold digging guru that is pretty famous now. I've been following her for a few years before she became famous for Sprinkle Sprinkle. And so, and also very personally in my own life, my own feminine presentation and self-fashioning has evolved over the last several years. And that had a lot to do with the pandemic and some personal stuff that I was going through. So I'll also sort of be talking about my own like journey with femininity and self-fashioning. So for me, I feel like these aesthetics in your personal life can be, if that's part of your gender affirmation, can be really empowering. Like I feel like if I'm sitting down when I'm doing my makeup, like that's a time of meditation for me. That's a time where I'm taking care of myself. And that process, I think, is a practice of care for me, but also enables me to care for other people. Like I'm a mother. I have two children. One of them is neurodivergent. Like I juggle a lot. And so I find that not only does feminine body presentation help me stay sane, but it connects me to other femmes too, who are like, hey, I like your nails, or hey, like I love that makeup. So in future episodes of my YouTube video that I'm editing, I talk to folks. One of them is in the chat, Gloria Negrete Lopez. We talk about femininity and abolition. That video is up. And I have others like Jess Droches waiting to be edited where we talk about this as well. So my upcoming work is definitely about that. So you can follow me on socials and I will post when that is out.
Great. Thank you so much. And we have one more question I think is a good tie-in to what you just said. The question, I'm curious if you've thought about your own process as a cultural producer in your YouTube interviews and the process of going from scholar to cultural producer.
Yes, thank you, Gloria. And like I said, you can go and watch my episode of Femme Study with Gloria. So thank you so much, Gloria, nameplate and makeup queen. Gloria is also a Chicana queer feminist scholar. That process to me has been so much fun. I feel like all I want to do now is be like a talk show host. And so that's what Femme Study is. It's like I find that the scholars and the artists in my life inspire me, and I just want to share their brilliance with the world and have conversations that can like feed back into scholarship. So like it was actually really rich for me to prepare for this talk by going to the YouTube video that me and Maria already did, right? So to me, it's also the sort of like way of like creating scholarship, feeding it into cultural production, and creating a kind of symbiotic relationship where that continues. And I think when I think about all the violence happening in the academy right now with students, I really do think that we need to like ASAP think of ways to do what we do outside of these institutions, particularly as me and my students in Florida have had to navigate like the possible shutting down of programs like ours in women's gender and sexuality studies, or like not being able to teach certain theories. We have to find autonomous ways of sharing knowledge.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we're now at time. But I think that's a really great place to sort of like end the talk and a sort of an invitation for us and the work that we do in the academy, but also importantly in the wider worlds that we sort of inhabit. So thank you, Dr. Hernandez, for your invitation. I'm so grateful to have you with us, and thanks to all who have been part of this conversation. I think please be well. And I think this YouTube recording will be available on the UCI Illumination site, so feel free to find that and to share it. And thank you again, Dr. Hernandez, and thanks everyone for coming.
And really quick, Raúl Romo, Villano and Tillano is totally part of that universe. So thank you for naming them. And I look forward to more work on Villano. Thank you again, Christopher. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye.
Okay.